The Yorkshire Witch. The Mary Bateman Case. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. The word witch. The word which has always been useful. It is useful because it compresses complexity into a single image: a woman with secret power, a woman who harms, a woman who does not belong. It is a word that carries centuries of fear and fascination, a word that can be used as accusation, explanation, and entertainment all at once. In the early 19th century, when Mary Bateman became known as the Yorkshire Witch, the label did not prove the supernatural. It proved something else: that the public required a story that felt large enough to hold its own discomfort. A woman who could deceive, manipulate, and kill was easier to understand if she could be imagined as something other than a woman. A witch is less troubling than a neighbor. A witch is less troubling than a mother. A witch is less troubling than an ordinary person who chooses harm. This manuscript does not treat the word witch as evidence. It treats it as a mirror. Because the true horror of Mary Bateman's case lies not in magic, but in belief, and in how belief can be engineered. It lies in poverty, illness, fear, and the desperate need for certainty. It lies in the narrow options available to working-class women, and the shadow economies that grew where official systems could not or would not protect people. It lies in the way communities can crave wonder while ignoring warning signs, and the way a skilled performer can turn that craving into power. Mary Bateman was not famous in her lifetime for being subtle. She was famous because she became spectacle. Her crimes unfolded in an England straining under the pressure of industrial change, where hunger and disease were ordinary and where spiritual explanations still ran alongside emerging modern medicine. In such an environment, a wise woman could make a living by selling cures, charms, and prophecies, and a predatory woman could use those same practices to take far more than money. The record shows fraud, deception, and the deliberate exploitation of vulnerable people. It shows a murder conviction and an execution. It also shows the machinery of public appetite: crowds, broadsheets, sensational accounts, and the fast-growing myth that swallowed the case almost as soon as it occurred. That myth is part of the story, but it is not the foundation of it. A truth-first account must begin with a promise: the difference between record and rumor will be held clearly. When sources disagree, the uncertainty will be acknowledged rather than smoothed over for the sake of narrative. When a detail exists primarily in sensational print, it will be treated as such. Where evidence is strong, it will be stated plainly. Where evidence is thin, it will not be padded with certainty that the historical record cannot support. The intention is not to strip away atmosphere. The intention is to respect the victims. Because the victims in this case were not characters written for a moral tale. They were ordinary people living in a world where illness could ruin a family, poverty could break a household, and desperation made even implausible promises feel worth believing. They turned to Mary Bateman not because they were foolish, but because the alternatives offered little comfort. The public later mocked them for believing in charms and spells, but the deeper question is why they needed to seek help outside formal systems in the first place. This manuscript is also written with the knowledge that female offenders are often treated differently in crime history. They are made into monsters or curiosities, their violence framed as unnatural, their punishment framed as spectacle. Mary Bateman's case is one of the clearest examples of this. Her execution did not end her story. It transformed it. Her body was used, displayed, and consumed by a public that wanted not only her death, but a souvenir of it. This is not only a story about a woman who killed. It is a story about what society did with that woman once it decided she was beyond redemption. It is a story about fear that becomes entertainment, punishment that becomes theater, and superstition that survives even in the act of condemning it. The question beneath everything is simple. If there was no magic, why did it work? The answer begins in the ordinary, in illness, in grief, in uncertainty, in the human desire to believe that suffering has a cause that can be named, and that a powerful person can remove it. Mary Bateman understood that desire. She stepped into it. And for a time, it made her dangerous. What follows is the case as it can be traced through the historical record: the woman behind the label, the victims behind the headlines, and the long shadow left behind when a community chose to call a criminal a witch rather than admit she was something far more unsettling: a human being. Chapter 1: Eisenby. Mary Bateman entered the world as Mary Harker, in a Yorkshire landscape shaped by small farms, narrow horizons, and the steady expectation that life would be hard and repetitive. The record places her birth around 1768, in or near Eisenby, a village close to Thirsk. It was not a place that produced notoriety. It produced labor. Her family were small farmers, which meant survival depended on weather, seasons, and constant work. Childhood in such a setting was not built for indulgence. It was built for usefulness. Children learned early to keep moving, to contribute, to obey, and to accept that scarcity was not unusual but ordinary. Education for a girl of her class would have been minimal. Schooling existed unevenly, often tied to the church or informal teaching, but literacy rates varied and were shaped by the practical demands of work. If Mary learned to read and write, it would likely have been enough to manage basic letters and accounts, rather than the kind of formal education associated with wealth. Yet even limited literacy could be powerful. In an environment where many struggled with reading, the ability to handle paper could become a form of authority. The story that would later be told about Mary Bateman often begins by implying something strange in her early years, as though danger must always announce itself in childhood. The record does not support that. What it suggests instead is ordinariness, a girl raised in the conditions that shaped thousands of others, with no reason for her name to survive beyond local memory. Yet ordinariness does not prevent a person from becoming dangerous. In many cases, it is precisely the ordinary origins that allow later crime to feel so shocking. Mary's adolescence would have been shaped by the same pressures that shaped most working-class girls in 18th-century England. There were few pathways to independence. Marriage was often the primary transition into adulthood. Domestic service was the primary form of employment. Poverty pressed hard. A woman without support could fall quickly. Domestic service offered a kind of mobility, but it was not the glamorous mobility of choice. It was the mobility of necessity, leaving home to serve in another household, working long hours for low wages, and living within rules set by employers. Servants learned to observe. They learned what people valued, what people hid, and how households were run. They learned the rhythms of food, illness, conflict, and private fear. These are the same skills that later make an effective con artist. It is likely Mary entered service young, as many girls did. The details of her employment are fragmentary in the record, but the broader truth holds. Service taught women how to perform respectability, how to speak carefully, how to shift tone depending on who is listening, how to appear harmless while carrying private resentment. For a woman inclined towards deception, service could function as an education in human weakness. The early years of Mary's life were not unique. What becomes striking in hindsight is the way she would later weaponize what she learned in these ordinary environments. Her later crimes were not committed through brute strength. They were committed through access, performance, and persuasion, skills that can grow quietly in a life spent watching others. The world Mary Bateman grew up in was also a world where fear and superstition existed alongside practical reality. Folk belief was not fringe. It was woven into daily life. People spoke of omens, curses, and charms not necessarily because they rejected religion, but because they lived in a world where suffering was constant and explanations were desperately sought. When illness arrived, it could destroy a family. When crops failed, hunger followed. When a child died, there was no comfort in science. Even for those who did not openly claim belief in magic, there was often a lingering readiness to accept that unseen forces might be at work. This cultural background matters because it provided a marketplace. A woman who could claim knowledge of hidden things, curses, prophecies, remedies, could find clients. A woman who could sell certainty could survive where honesty did not pay. The environment did not create Mary Bateman, but it offered fertile ground for the role she would later adopt. A small village girl could disappear into the mass of the working poor and live an unrecorded life. Mary did not. Somewhere between early labor and adulthood, she began to move towards crime, not as a sudden break, but as a gradual pattern. Theft, fraud, and deception were not unusual among the desperately poor, but Mary's later record suggests something more sustained than a single act of desperation. It suggests a person who learned that deception worked, and who was willing to keep using it. By the time she left the narrow fields of her early life and moved into wider society, she carried the same burdens as many women of her class: limited protection, limited opportunity, and constant economic pressure. What she did with those burdens would later make her infamous. Chapter 2: Service and Survival. In the lives of poor women, survival often depends on being believed. A servant must be trusted around household goods. A laundress must be trusted with fabric. A nursemaid must be trusted with children. A working-class woman who lives inside someone else's home must be seen as harmless, diligent, and grateful, even when she is exhausted, angry, or desperate. Domestic service is performance. It demands obedience, restraint, and the ability to swallow humiliation. It also demands a kind of invisibility. A servant is present everywhere, yet treated as though they are not. They hear private conversations. They see how illness is managed. They see how money is hidden. They see how fear travels through households when something goes wrong. This is not a romantic environment. It is an education in the mechanics of power. Mary Bateman's early adulthood unfolded within this world. The details are not preserved in a tidy sequence, but the broad structure is clear. She moved through work and marriage in a society that offered working-class women few stable options. The system did not provide security. It provided dependence. Marriage could offer stability, but it could also create new forms of vulnerability. A husband could be protection or danger, comfort or burden. Records indicate Mary married John Bateman and had children, stepping into the expected shape of womanhood. Yet domestic respectability did not erase the pressures that had shaped her early life. If anything, it tightened them. Poverty in marriage is still poverty, and responsibility increases with each child. In many cases, small theft and fraud emerge in such circumstances because the difference between surviving and failing can be a single unpaid bill or an empty pantry. But Mary Bateman's later history suggests not only need, but inclination. There are indications of repeated criminal behavior, thefts, cons, deceptions, that point towards a person who learned early that rules were not enforced evenly, and that manipulation could provide what labor could not. The first known offenses are often described as petty, yet the word petty can be misleading. Petty crime is not always petty in intent. It can be the beginning of a pattern, the testing of boundaries, the learning of risk, the discovery of what a person can get away with. A person who steals once may feel shame. A person who steals repeatedly learns confidence. Mary Bateman's confidence would later become her most dangerous trait. It is important, however, not to collapse cause and effect too neatly. Poverty and limited opportunity do not automatically produce murder. Most people who suffer hardship do not harm others. The difference lies not only in circumstance, but in choice. In the moment a person decides that another's fear, illness, or trust is not something to respect, but something to use. Mary's early offenses suggest she was willing to use. Domestic work provided access. It brought her into contact with people who owned more than she did. It showed her how the better-off managed life. It also showed her how easily a household could be disrupted by sickness, money trouble, or scandal. This knowledge was practical, and for a con artist it becomes a blueprint. Find the pressure point, then present a solution. The earliest version of Mary Bateman's criminal identity likely did not involve grand claims of prophecy. It likely involved simpler acts, taking goods, deceiving employers, exploiting trust. These acts do not require charisma on a public stage. They require something quieter, the ability to seem safe. To seem safe is to be allowed close. And closeness is power. As Mary moved further into adulthood, her life became increasingly defined by movement, the kind of movement common to working-class people searching for stability, shifting employment, shifting lodging, shifting social circles. In such lives, identity is flexible. People do not always know each other's full history. A new town can be a new beginning. A new employer can be a clean slate. A new story can be told because there is no one present to contradict it. This flexibility can be survival for ordinary people. For a predatory person, it becomes opportunity. Mary's next transition was into a role that would eventually make her notorious, the role of the wise woman. This role did not require her to be officially educated. It required her to appear to know things other people did not. It required her to offer certainty in a world where certainty was rare. It required her to perform authority, spiritual, medicinal, or mystical, and to convince others that she was the solution to their fear. The wise woman role did not emerge from nothing. It grew from older folk traditions and from the real gaps in early 19th century healthcare. Doctors were expensive. Treatment could be brutal. Many conditions had no effective remedy. Fear lived in bodies because bodies were fragile and death was close. In that environment, a woman selling cures could become credible quickly. Mary Bateman learned how to use that credibility. She learned how to create ritual. She learned how to speak in a way that sounded like hidden knowledge. She learned how to make ordinary coincidences seem like proof. She learned how to turn clients into believers and believers into dependents. Her life, which began in a small Yorkshire village, was now moving towards a city where belief could become currency. Chapter 3: Marriage, John Bateman. And the life of a poor woman. Marriage was meant to be an ending. For many women, it was presented as the close of uncertainty, a roof, a name, a place in the world, a predictable structure. But for working-class women in 18th-century England, marriage often altered hardship rather than removing it. The labor continued. The money remained scarce. The future stayed fragile. Mary Harker became Mary Bateman through her marriage to John Bateman, a shift that placed her inside the expected social category of wife and mother. The record indicates children, domestic responsibilities, and the constant strain of maintaining a household with limited resources. In a life like this, hunger sits close to the table even when food is present. One illness can ruin a month. One lost job can become catastrophe. Yet hardship alone cannot explain what Mary Bateman would become. Many women endured the same conditions and did not exploit their neighbors. Many lived through hunger and grief without turning to deception as a way of life. The difference in Mary's case appears not only in circumstance but in pattern. She used the social structures of marriage and domestic life as cover, while gradually building a separate identity shaped by manipulation. Marriage offered Mary something valuable beyond companionship. It offered respectability. A married woman could be trusted more easily than an unmarried one. A mother could be viewed as harmless by default. A wife could move through social spaces with fewer questions. Respectability operates like a pass in a community. It does not guarantee safety, but it reduces scrutiny. Mary Bateman's later success depended on reduced scrutiny. The domestic sphere also placed her close to the central anxieties of the era: fear of illness, fear of childbirth, fear of children dying, fear of financial collapse, fear of social judgment. Women were the managers of these fears in many households. They tended the sick. They prepared food. They handled small economies. They were expected to keep families alive with whatever tools were available. In such a world, the line between care and control can become thin. Mary's marriage did not isolate her from crime. If anything, it gave her space to practice deception without immediately appearing suspicious. It is not always possible to determine where her fraud began and how early it became habitual, because working-class lives often left few records unless they collided with the law. But what later emerges is a person who understood how to move between roles: the respectable married woman, the helpful figure, the one who knew remedies, the one who claimed insight. These shifts are not always dramatic. Often they begin as small performances. A woman gives advice. A woman offers a charm. A woman claims to know a cure. A woman hints that she has seen something in a dream. Another woman listens, because the alternative is helplessness. Helplessness is expensive. People will pay to escape it. Mary also appears to have experienced instability within her personal life. Accounts suggest separation and conflict, and some indicate that her relationship with John Bateman did not provide lasting security. Whether through estrangement, financial stress, or other turmoil, the marriage did not protect her from precarity. This matters because in the lives of working-class women, insecurity can make identity more flexible. A woman who cannot rely on a husband must rely on herself. Mary relied on herself. But she did not rely on honest work alone. The name Bateman remained with her, yet her life began moving beyond the narrow domestic story of wife and mother. She shifted into the wider world where belief could be turned into money, and where poverty created both need and opportunity. Leeds, an expanding industrial city, offered a crowded stage. People were desperate. People were sick. People were afraid. The gap between what medicine could do and what people needed was wide. Into that gap stepped those who offered cures outside formal authority: herbalists, charm sellers, fortune-tellers, wise women. Mary Bateman became one of them. Chapter 4: A Woman Who Takes. There is a kind of crime that begins with shame and ends with confidence. At first, the offender fears being caught. They glance over their shoulder. They convince themselves it is a one-time act. They promise they will stop. But if the act succeeds, if money is gained, if punishment is avoided, if the lie holds, the fear dulls. The act becomes easier. The shame becomes optional. In Mary Bateman's case, the record suggests not a single fall into wrongdoing, but an accumulation. Theft, deception, and fraud appear repeatedly in accounts of her life. These offenses may have been described as small, but the repetition matters more than the size. Repetition suggests a person who learns something essential, that rules can be bent, and that people can be managed. Fraud is not simply taking. Fraud is persuading others to give. It requires understanding what people want and what they fear. It requires the ability to speak convincingly. It requires the ability to read hesitation and apply pressure in just the right amount. It is, in many ways, a social skill. Mary Bateman's later identity as a witch was an extension of this skill. The public often imagines witches as solitary figures, but Mary's power came from interaction. She was not isolated. She was embedded. She fed on the needs of other people. Before she became infamous, she was already practicing the central tool of her later crimes, confidence. In the domestic world of servants and neighbors, confidence crime can begin quietly. A borrowed item is never returned. A debt is invented. A story is told to excuse a disappearance of goods. A person claims a hardship that produces sympathy. Another person offers assistance, and the offender takes it. These acts are easy to rationalize in a harsh economy. The offender can say the world is unfair, that survival requires bending rules, that everyone would do the same if pushed hard enough. The rationalization is often how a predator becomes comfortable. Mary Bateman's evolution appears to have followed this path, small deceptions growing into a deliberate practice. Over time, she became a woman who did not simply accept hardship, but exploited it. She moved into the spaces where the desperate gathered, where fear created opportunity, and she presented herself not as a threat, but as a solution. What made her effective was that she offered something people crave deeply: explanation. Illness without explanation is terrifying. Misfortune without explanation feels unbearable. People want reasons. They want names for their suffering. They want to believe that suffering is not random, that it has a cause that can be identified and therefore controlled. Mary Bateman sold causes. She sold curses. She sold hidden enemies and spiritual forces. Once a person accepts that their misfortune is caused by a curse, the next step becomes easy: they need someone to remove it. The witch becomes both the problem and the solution, depending on what role she chooses to play. Mary chose to play the role of the solution. This is where fraud becomes predation. Because when an offender sells spiritual certainty, they are not merely stealing money. They are stealing autonomy. They are guiding a victim's decisions. They are shaping how a victim interprets their body, their family, their future. They are replacing reality with a narrative that keeps the offender at the center. The pattern that would later culminate in murder was built through these earlier acts. Mary Bateman learned that people will hand over money and goods if they believe it is the price of safety. She learned that fear weakens resistance. She learned that repeated ritual creates dependence. She learned that if she could become the interpreter of a person's suffering, she could control them. Control is addictive. And once a predator has control, they often seek to deepen it. Chapter 5, Leeds, a city that believes. Leeds was not built for comfort. By the time Mary Bateman established herself there, it was a city swelling with industrial momentum, a place of mills, labor, smoke, and crowded streets. People came looking for work, and they stayed because leaving meant hunger. The city grew quickly, and with rapid growth came conditions that favored disease: packed housing, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and bodies worn down by labor. Fear was everywhere. Fear of illness. Fear of injury. Fear of losing wages. Fear of a child dying. Fear of being forced into the workhouse. Fear of debts that could not be paid. In such a city, the poor did not have the luxury of waiting for official help. Doctors were costly, and medicine could be crude. Treatments could be harsh. For many, the line between medical care and danger was unclear. People often relied on what they could afford: home remedies, herbal cures, neighbor advice, and the services of those who claimed specialized knowledge outside the official system. This is where the wise woman thrives. A wise woman does not need formal credentials. She needs reputation. She needs confidence. She needs to speak as though she knows what is hidden, as though she can name what others cannot see. In times of uncertainty, certainty becomes a product, and people will pay for it. Mary Bateman understood leads because she understood fear. She also understood that fear does not have to be invented. It only has to be redirected. A woman with stomach pain can be told she is cursed. A child's fever can be framed as spiritual attack. A run of bad luck can become evidence of an enemy. A marriage strained by poverty can be described as poisoned by witchcraft. Once fear has a name, it can be managed, and the person who provides the management becomes powerful. Mary Bateman built her identity in Leeds by offering prophecy, charms, and cures. She presented herself as a woman who could see what others could not. She created an aura of hidden knowledge, not necessarily through overt claims of supernatural power, but through the careful language of suggestion. She hinted. She implied. She staged small proofs. She exploited coincidence. She used ritual to make her work feel real. Ritual is persuasive because it feels like action. Even when it is empty, it gives the suffering person something to do. It makes them feel less helpless. It gives them the illusion of control. And once a person feels they have control, they will cling to the one who provided it. This is how Mary Bateman embedded herself in households. She did not arrive as a threat. She arrived as relief. The city's religious atmosphere also mattered. This period was rich with spiritual excitement, prophecy, and moral panic. The poor often moved between official religion and folk belief, not because they were ignorant, but because both provided frameworks for making sense of hardship. When a person's life contains constant suffering, they seek meaning where they can find it. Mary Bateman positioned herself as a meaning maker. Leeds also offered anonymity. In a village, reputation is fixed. In a city, reputation can be built. A woman can reinvent herself more easily among strangers. She can leave one street and appear on another with a slightly altered story. She can cultivate new clients without the weight of her old history. This flexibility allowed Mary Bateman to expand her influence. She could be a wise woman to one person, a friend to another, a spiritual authority to a third. Each relationship reinforced the others, because belief spreads through conversation. If one neighbor swears by a charm, another neighbor listens. In this way, Mary's business grew through the simplest advertising there is. Word of mouth. Her notoriety also grew through spectacle. Leeds was the kind of place where rumors traveled fast because people lived close and spoke often. A woman claiming hidden knowledge became a figure of fascination. Some believed her. Some mocked her. Some feared her. Yet even mockery can spread reputation. The label which becomes powerful because it carries both attraction and dread. Mary Bateman benefited from both. By the time she entered the lives of the Perigo family, she had already established herself as a woman who could command attention and obedience through her claims. She had already learned how to extract money, goods, and trust. She had already learned how to turn private fear into dependence. The Perigo case did not begin as a murder case. It began as a belief case. Chapter 6: The Making of a Wise Woman. Mary Bateman did not invent superstition. She organized it. The figure of the wise woman already existed across Britain long before Bateman entered Leeds. In working-class communities, a wise woman could be a healer, a charm seller, a midwife, a fortune-teller, a person consulted when formal systems were out of reach or unaffordable. These roles were not always sinister. In many cases, they were practical. A woman who understood herbs, basic remedies, or the emotional language of reassurance could be useful in a place where illness was constant. Mary Bateman recognized the shape of this role and turned it into a business. Her power did not come from the supernatural. It came from method. She approached belief the way a professional approaches a trade. She studied what persuaded, what frightened, and what created loyalty. She learned how to speak in the particular cadence that sounds like hidden knowledge. She learned how to make ordinary coincidences feel like signs. She learned how to appear reluctant, as though her gift was a burden, which only made her seem more authentic. A wise woman gains credibility through performance. Mary Bateman's performance relied on several key techniques. The first was specificity. General statements do not persuade. Specific statements do. A person will doubt there is trouble ahead, but they will remember a dark-haired woman wishes you harm, or a letter will arrive, or something has been placed in your food. Specificity creates the illusion of insight. It allows the client to link future events to the wise woman's words, even when those events are normal. The second technique was ritual. Ritual makes belief tangible. A charm held in the hand feels like a solution. An object buried under a doorstep feels like protection. A prayer written on paper feels like action. A token placed beneath a pillow feels like defense. Ritual also creates dependency, because it requires repeat visits, repeat instructions, repeat payment. The third technique was controlled fear. Mary Bateman did not offer reassurance without cost. Her reassurance was structured as a bargain: fear first, then relief. A client is told a curse is present, an enemy is working against them, a spiritual force is attacking their body or household. Only then is the cure offered. This structure makes the wise woman essential. She becomes the interpreter of the client's suffering and the only person who can undo it. The fourth technique was escalation. A basic charm might soothe anxiety, but it does not necessarily bind a client long-term. Escalation does. If the charm works, the wise woman claims credit. If the charm does not work, the wise woman claims the curse is stronger than expected. The solution becomes more complex, more expensive, more dependent on obedience. The client is drawn deeper into the story because leaving feels dangerous. The fifth technique was isolating the client from doubt. Mary Bateman knew that doubt is the enemy of exploitation. She controlled doubt by giving clients rules: do not speak of this to certain people, do not seek a doctor, do not refuse the ritual, do not question the process. Doubt was framed as spiritual risk. Disobedience was framed as danger. The client learned that hesitation itself could bring harm. This is not magic. It is psychological coercion. Once these techniques are understood, Mary Bateman's later crimes become clearer. She did not simply sell charms. She sold control, and she sold it inside the ordinary structures of domestic life. She entered homes through conversation and left those homes carrying money, goods, and the quiet authority of someone believed. Her skill lay in the fact that she did not need to overpower people physically. She let fear do it for her. Mary Bateman also understood public theater. A wise woman does not necessarily need a crowd, but a crowd amplifies reputation. A spectacle can turn a small household con into a citywide phenomenon, and Leeds was hungry for spectacle. This hunger would become clear in the most infamous hoax connected to Bateman's name. Chapter 7, Faith, Prophecy, and the Hunger for Signs. To modern readers, it can be tempting to treat belief as a weakness. But belief is not always a sign of ignorance. Often it is a sign of strain. When life is uncertain, people seek patterns. When suffering is constant, people crave meaning. When a future feels unstable, prophecy becomes comforting because it turns randomness into narrative. This was the environment in which Mary Bateman operated. In the early 19th century, Britain was changing rapidly. Industrialization reshaped cities and families. Labor conditions were brutal. Hunger moved through communities. Disease was ordinary. Medical knowledge was limited. Religion remained central, yet the religious world itself was fractured, filled with revival movements, sermons about judgment, and a constant sense that the world was shifting towards a reckoning. In this kind of atmosphere, prophecy thrives. People look for signs not because they want fantasy, but because they want certainty. A sign suggests that events are not meaningless. A sign suggests that suffering will be understood, that endings will be explained, that justice will arrive. Mary Bateman learned to speak into this hunger. Her wise woman identity worked on the scale of households, but she also understood the larger emotional weather of the time. She understood that the public loved wonder and feared judgment. She understood that if she could position herself as a conduit for prophecy, her authority would grow far beyond any one client. Authority is a kind of currency. A woman like Bateman could not accumulate wealth or status through formal means. She was not born into privilege. She did not have official credentials. She did not have a platform granted by class. But she could build a platform out of attention. Attention can be gathered the same way belief is gathered. One person speaks. Another repeats. A rumor travels. A claim becomes a story. A story becomes a phenomenon. In working-class communities, news was not always delivered through formal outlets. It was delivered through markets, pubs, mills, churches, and doorstep conversation. A sensational claim could travel quickly and grow in the telling. A woman who could supply such claims became valuable, not necessarily respected, but fascinating. Fascination is not harmless. Fascination is how predators test limits. Mary Bateman's success depended on her ability to create and survive scrutiny. A private con relies on secrecy. A public phenomenon invites exposure. To move into public spectacle and survive, Bateman needed both confidence and a willingness to risk humiliation. She had both. The culture of prophecy also gave her another advantage: it made the extraordinary feel plausible. In times of social instability, people are more likely to accept that strange events might signal something larger. When poverty and disease are everywhere, the world already feels haunted. A sign from God or a sign from the devil does not feel far-fetched when everyday life contains constant evidence of suffering. Bateman's genius, if the word can be used without admiration, was that she did not fight against the world's belief structure. She used it. She presented herself as someone who could interpret the unseen, and she did so in a way that blended religious language with folk tradition. This blending is important. A wise woman who only speaks of curses may be dismissed by those who prefer church authority. A wise woman who frames her claims in spiritual language can appear aligned with broader belief rather than opposed to it. In this way, Bateman could appeal to a larger group. Her performance became more than a service. It became a spectacle. The most famous spectacle associated with her name involved an animal, and a public so eager for signs that they were willing to suspend the most basic doubts. Chapter 8: The Prophet Hen of Leeds. The prophet hen story is often told as comedy. It should be treated as warning. It is a hoax so absurd that it can seem harmless at first glance, a hen that lays eggs stamped with prophetic messages. Yet the hoax mattered because it demonstrated Mary Bateman's ability to manufacture belief at scale, to create a spectacle, to profit from it, and to convince ordinary people to accept the impossible when they desperately wanted meaning. The core claim was simple: a hen in Leeds was laying eggs that carried messages, often interpreted as prophetic or divine. People came to see it. They paid. They watched. They spoke about it. The story grew, traveling beyond the immediate neighborhood into wider public conversation. What gave the hoax power was not the hen. It was the audience. Leeds was full of people who lived under pressure, people who craved signs that their suffering meant something. A prophetic egg suggested a world where messages could arrive from beyond ordinary life. It suggested that the future was not chaos but coded. It suggested that judgment, salvation, or change might be close. Mary Bateman exploited this hunger by turning the hoax into a paid experience. People were charged to see the egg-laying. The event carried the thrill of witnessing something rare. Even skeptics were drawn in because spectacle does not require belief to attract attention. People attend spectacles to be amused, to be entertained, to have something to talk about. But many did believe. The hoax worked because Bateman staged it carefully. The method, once exposed, was vulgar and direct. Messages were written and the eggs were manipulated to create the illusion of prophecy. The specifics of how this was done have been reported in various ways over time, but the central truth stands: the prophecy was manufactured, and the manufacturing was deliberate. The hoax could have ended Mary Bateman's career. Public exposure can ruin a con artist. Humiliation can destroy credibility. Once a person is revealed as a fraud, their authority can collapse. Yet Bateman survived. This is one of the most revealing details of her story. She survived exposure because the appetite for belief did not vanish when the hoax was uncovered. Some people laughed and moved on. Some were embarrassed and refused to speak of it. Some remained loyal, perhaps because to admit deception would mean admitting personal foolishness. Others simply treated it as entertainment rather than betrayal. Bateman's survival after the hoax suggests a truth about the world she lived in: belief does not always depend on evidence. Sometimes it depends on need. Sometimes it depends on the desire not to be wrong. Sometimes it depends on the emotional satisfaction of a story, even when the story has been exposed as false. The prophet hen also revealed Bateman's willingness to push beyond the private domestic con into public performance. She was not merely a woman selling charms quietly in kitchens. She was a woman willing to draw crowds. She understood attention. She understood the value of notoriety. Notoriety can be repackaged as power. A wise woman does not need to be admired. She needs to be talked about. After the prophet hen, Mary Bateman's name became more widely known, and the label which began to attach itself more firmly. The word functioned as both mockery and fear. Those who dismissed her used it as ridicule. Those who feared her used it as explanation. Either way, the label gave her a brand. Brands are useful to predators. They provide recognition, and recognition brings clients. Bateman's business depended on clients. The hoax therefore functioned as an advertisement as much as a scandal. It also established her central skill. She could produce evidence where none existed. She could manufacture proof. She could stage reality. She could convince people they were witnessing something true, even as she was creating it. This skill would later become deadly. Because if a person can manufacture prophecy, they can also manufacture illness. They can manufacture fear. They can manufacture the idea that a victim's suffering is caused by a curse rather than by poison. The prophet hen is not merely a strange footnote. It is a blueprint. Chapter 9, An Evil Wish, Rebecca Perigo's Fear. The Perigo case did not begin with murder. It began the way many predatory stories begin, with a household already strained, a woman already frightened, and a community where fear had become ordinary enough to be sold. Rebecca Perigo lived in Bramley, near Leeds, within a world shaped by the same forces that shaped so many working families of the time. Limited money, constant labor, and the quiet dread that illness could undo everything. The historical record preserves her chiefly through the tragedy that followed, which is itself part of the injustice. Victims are often remembered only at the moment they were harmed. Yet before she became a name in a trial, Rebecca was a person with a daily life, relationships, and a body that carried its own vulnerabilities. Illness and anxiety are not unusual in such conditions. In working-class communities, sickness could be relentless. Food quality was variable. Water was unreliable. The air was heavy with smoke and industrial residue. Medical help was costly and not always effective. Pain could become a permanent feature of life, and fear often grew from pain because pain suggests decline, and decline suggests loss. Rebecca's fear seems to have become focused on the idea that someone wished her harm. Whether this began as a superstition, a personal anxiety, or a reaction to genuine social conflict, it became a story that shaped her behavior. The fear of an evil wish is not merely a colorful phrase. It represents a mental landscape where suffering has an enemy, where misfortune is not random, but directed. Such beliefs can be socially contagious. If a woman feels unwell and begins to suspect malice, neighbors may reinforce the suspicion. A difficult relationship can be reframed as spiritual attack. A run of bad luck can become proof that someone is working against the household. In communities where folk belief remains active, the idea of an evil influence does not have to be invented by a con artist. It only has to be sharpened. This is where Mary Bateman enters the story. By the time she encountered the Perigo family, Bateman had already built a reputation as a woman who could interpret fear. She could speak of curses and charms. She could offer the idea that unseen forces could be named and controlled. To a frightened household, this is not merely theater. It feels like relief. It feels like a map in the middle of confusion. Rebecca Perigo's vulnerability was not stupidity. It was need. A woman seeking explanation for pain, misfortune, or anxiety is not automatically gullible. She is human. She is doing what humans often do, looking for meaning and for someone who seems confident enough to provide it. Bateman offered confidence. The initial approach did not need to be aggressive. In con artistry, the best trap is one that feels like the victim's decision. A wise woman can begin by listening. She can ask questions. She can mirror the client's fears. She can appear sympathetic. She can create intimacy by treating the client as special, someone worthy of secret knowledge. She can suggest that others do not understand, that doctors cannot help, that only spiritual methods can address the real cause. Once the client accepts this framework, the wise woman becomes a necessary figure. The Perigos were not a family of leisure. William Perigo worked, and the household operated under the stress common to their class. Their resources were limited, their time was consumed by survival, and the emotional bandwidth needed to resist manipulation was likely already strained. In such circumstances, a person offering a clear explanation and a pathway to relief can become irresistibly persuasive. Bateman's method was not simply to frighten. It was to frighten and then soothe. She could claim to detect the presence of a curse. She could claim to know who sent it. She could claim that certain symptoms were proof of spiritual attack. The details would vary, but the shape remained constant. The client's fear becomes validated, then escalated, then positioned as solvable only through the wise woman's intervention. From this point, payment begins. Payment is not always framed as greedy demand. It can be framed as necessary materials. It can be framed as the cost of ritual items. It can be framed as a spiritual bargain. It can be framed as generosity expected in exchange for help. People who are frightened often pay willingly because the payment feels like an investment in safety. Bateman also understood that the most effective cons do not end after one transaction. They create a relationship. A relationship allows repeated extraction. It also allows deeper control. Over time, the victim begins to make choices based on the wise woman's instructions rather than their own judgment. The victim begins to interpret symptoms and events through the wise woman's framework. Doubt is reframed as danger. Compliance is reframed as protection. This is how fraud becomes captivity. By the time the Perigos were deeply involved with Bateman, their household was no longer operating entirely under ordinary reality. It was operating under a constructed reality in which curses and spiritual threats were treated as primary causes, and Mary Bateman was treated as the authority who could manage them. Once a person reaches that position, the relationship becomes more than a service. It becomes dependency. And dependency is where predators thrive, because dependency is a form of power that requires no physical force. It only requires persuasion sustained over time. Rebecca Perigos's fear did not end with Bateman's arrival. It intensified. This is the danger of a wise woman who is not truly attempting to comfort. A predatory wise woman does not soothe permanently. She keeps the fear alive, because fear is what keeps the client returning. The client becomes trapped in a cycle: fear, cure, relief, renewed fear. The Perigos were now inside that cycle. Chapter 10: The Contract of Dependence. A con does not succeed because the lie is convincing. It succeeds because the victim cannot afford to reject it. By the time Mary Bateman became a regular presence in the Perigo household, what had begun as consultation was hardening into a contract, not a written agreement, but an emotional one. Bateman offered interpretation of fear, and in return she received trust, obedience, and payment. The more the Perigos relied on her, the less they could imagine navigating their fear without her. This is how dependency becomes self-reinforcing. Bateman's treatments were not presented as simple charms. They were structured as a system: rituals, instructions, prohibitions, and repeated acts that required ongoing involvement. A woman seeking help for illness or misfortune might be given objects to keep, words to recite, items to bury, and behaviors to follow. The instructions did not only promise relief. They demanded compliance. Compliance is the center of predation. Because compliance is what allows a predator to control a life without ever needing to strike it. For the Perigos, the system likely began as a series of small steps. A charm here, a ritual there, a payment made with the comfort of believing it would bring protection. If any relief followed, even temporary relief, it would be treated as proof of Bateman's power. If relief did not follow, Bateman could interpret that too: the curse was stronger than expected, someone was resisting, further steps were needed. This creates a trap. If the victim feels better, Bateman is credited. If the victim feels worse, Bateman is still credited, because worsening is framed as evidence of the enemy's power and the danger of disobedience. In this way, the wise woman becomes impossible to disprove. Bateman also used fear as a lever to extract payment. Payment could be framed as the cost of materials, but it often moved into something broader: money, goods, and items of value that could be justified as part of the cure. What Bateman took was not only cash but the slow stripping of household resources. For working-class families, this is not a small harm. A few shillings could matter. A piece of clothing could matter. A household item could matter. The Perigos did not have excess. Every transfer of goods from their home into Bateman's hands would have tightened the economic pressure already shaping their lives. Yet they continued. This is what con artistry does at its deepest level. It makes the victim feel responsible for continuing the payment. If payment stops, the victim fears the curse will return. If payment stops, the victim fears that the wise woman will withdraw protection. In some cases, the victim fears retaliation, not because the wise woman has threatened them directly, but because the narrative itself implies danger. A wise woman does not need to threaten. The curse becomes the threat. Bateman's influence likely extended beyond financial extraction. It would have shaped the Perigos's decisions in daily life. It may have discouraged medical consultation. It may have encouraged secrecy. It may have required Rebecca to interpret her own body through Bateman's words rather than her own instincts. A victim in this situation becomes cut off from alternative explanations. Once alternative explanations are cut off, the predator becomes the sole source of meaning and relief. This is why the contract of dependence is so dangerous. It shifts power from the victim to the offender in a way that feels voluntary, even as it becomes increasingly coercive. Bateman, meanwhile, became more than an outsider selling charms. She became an authority embedded within the household. The more she was consulted, the more she belonged, and the more she belonged, the harder it became to remove her. In working-class communities, where privacy is limited and neighborhood ties are tight, removing such a figure could also have social consequences. People fear public judgment. They fear ridicule for having believed. They fear admitting vulnerability. Predators rely on shame as much as they rely on fear. The Perigos's shame would have grown as the relationship deepened. The deeper they went, the harder it became to admit error. The more they paid, the more they needed to believe the payment was justified. This is how victims become trapped, not because they lack intelligence, but because the human mind struggles to abandon something it has invested in deeply. Bateman understood this. The contract of dependence was now in place. Chapter 11. Control becomes routine. Control is most effective when it feels normal. A person does not need chains if they can shape routine. Routine decides what a person does each day, who they speak to, and how they interpret their own experiences. If routine is controlled by a predator, the victim becomes manageable without ever realizing the full extent of their captivity. In the Perigos household, Mary Bateman's influence began to function as routine. Her instructions would have become part of daily life: what to eat, what to avoid, where to place objects, when to recite prayers or charms, how to respond to symptoms. The household's language may have shifted too. Ordinary discomforts might be spoken of as signs. Normal misfortunes might be described as attacks. The household's emotional weather would have been shaped by Bateman's interpretation of events. This is not merely manipulation. It is reprogramming. To maintain control, Bateman needed the Perigos to stay inside her framework. That meant restricting doubt. Doubt can appear through outsiders: a neighbor who laughs, a doctor who offers a different diagnosis, a friend who questions the wise woman's authority. Bateman therefore had incentive to discourage outside voices. This discouragement could take many forms. A doctor may be described as useless or dangerous. Medicines may be framed as poison. Medical advice may be treated as interference. Neighbors may be described as jealous or malicious. Friends may be described as part of the curse. Once outsiders are reclassified as threats, the victim withdraws. Isolation is one of the oldest tools of coercion, and it does not require physical imprisonment. It requires belief. If a victim believes the outside world cannot be trusted, the victim withdraws willingly. The household becomes smaller. The predator becomes larger. This is the stage where Mary Bateman's fraud began to resemble something darker than simple theft. It became an occupation of the victim's mind. Rebecca Perigos's fear would have been sustained and managed by Bateman's presence. Each symptom could be interpreted as proof that the curse was active. Each improvement could be claimed as proof that Bateman's cure was working. The victim's body itself becomes part of the con. For a predator, a body that cannot be explained is an opportunity. Bateman also had practical control. She was a visitor with influence. She could enter the household. She could prepare foods or administer treatments. She could direct the victim to eat certain things, avoid other things, consume substances framed as medicine. In a world without regulated pharmaceuticals and with a reliance on home remedies, such acts could appear ordinary. Poison hides best inside ordinary care. To the family, Bateman likely continued presenting herself as the helpful figure. That image is crucial. A predator cannot maintain control if they appear openly predatory. The predator must appear necessary, benevolent, burdened by the gift of insight, perhaps even reluctant, as though they are doing difficult work on the family's behalf. This performance creates trust. Trust creates access. Access creates vulnerability. As the relationship progressed, Bateman's extraction would have continued. Money, goods, and perhaps promises of future reward. The con works best when it can be framed as investment, pay now, and safety will follow. The household may have felt it was purchasing not only cure, but protection for the future. In a fearful mind, future protection feels priceless. Bateman's routine control also created emotional dependence. Victims in such situations can begin to rely on the predator not only for solutions but for reassurance. The wise woman becomes a figure of certainty in an uncertain life. Even when she causes fear, she is the one who interprets and contains it. This creates a bond that outsiders struggle to understand. It looks like loyalty. It is captivity. At this stage, the Perigos were not simply paying for charms. They were living inside a story that Mary Bateman had built around them. The longer they lived inside it, the more real it became. Reality becomes flexible when fear and suggestion are sustained. This is how the foundation for murder is laid. Because once a predator controls routine, the predator can introduce harm gradually. Harm can be framed as treatment. Sickness can be framed as proof that the curse is fighting back. A victim's decline can be framed as spiritual struggle. If a victim dies, the predator can claim the curse was too strong. The predator can remain the authority even at the moment of death. This is why Mary Bateman's case is so chilling. It shows how belief can be weaponized until the victim can no longer distinguish care from harm. Chapter 12: Poison in the Kitchen. Poison is the perfect crime in a domestic world. It does not require strength. It does not require visible violence. It can be administered in food, in drink, in medicine, in a spoonful of comfort. It hides inside care. It turns the kitchen, the symbol of nourishment, into a site of harm. In Mary Bateman's case, the record places poison at the center of Rebecca Perigo's death. The most famous detail is the poisoned pudding, a domestic image so ordinary that it becomes disturbing. Pudding is associated with warmth and comfort, yet in this story it becomes the vehicle for death. The importance of this detail is not its sensationalism. It is its method. A woman who has gained the trust of a household can introduce poison without resistance. If the food is presented as part of a cure, the victim consumes it willingly. If the victim becomes ill, the wise woman has already built the explanation. It is the curse. It is the enemy. It is spiritual struggle. The victim's suffering becomes proof of the narrative rather than proof of the crime. This is how poison and belief function together. The victim's body becomes unreliable evidence, because the predator has already told the victim what their body means. Rebecca Perigo's illness worsened. The decline, as recorded in accounts of the case, unfolded over time rather than as a sudden collapse. This is consistent with poisoning, particularly with substances that produce progressive symptoms. The household would have seen pain, weakness, and deterioration, and under Bateman's influence, these symptoms could be interpreted as spiritual warfare. Bateman's advantage was that she had created a framework where harm could be reclassified as evidence of the cure's necessity. A victim who becomes sicker may become more obedient, not less. Fear intensifies. Dependence deepens. The victim clings harder to the person who claims to be fighting on their behalf. In the kitchen, poison can be hidden as remedy. A spoonful may be described as medicinal. A dish may be described as necessary. A drink may be described as cleansing. The victim obeys because they believe disobedience will worsen the curse. Bateman, by this stage, was not merely extracting goods and money. She was directing a household's interpretation of reality. This is the true power of her con. It did not rely on the victim ignoring evidence. It relied on the victim being taught that evidence meant something else. When Rebecca Perigo's illness escalated, the family may have been pulled between fear, hope, and confusion. A husband may hesitate. A neighbor may speak. A doubt may appear. But doubts in such cases often arrive too late, because the victim's decline becomes the crisis that consumes the household. When a person is desperately ill, decisions are made under panic. People grasp for anything that offers hope. Bateman offered hope, even as she delivered harm. The record indicates that poison was later found in Bateman's possession, and that the prosecution argued it was used to kill Rebecca. This physical evidence became crucial because it anchored the case in something beyond belief and testimony. It created a tangible link between Bateman and the means of death. Still, the emotional reality of Rebecca's final period remains one of quiet horror. A woman who sought help for fear and illness found herself trapped inside a predatory narrative, and her body became the place where that narrative ended. Domestic life, food, care, household routine, became the mechanism of her killing. This is what makes Mary Bateman a figure of enduring fascination. She did not operate in alleys or remote places. She operated in kitchens, in living rooms, in the intimate spaces where people believe they are safest. Chapter 13, Death, 1808. Rebecca Perigo. Death, in working-class households, was not rare. Yet when death arrived after weeks or months of strange treatments, repeated payments, and constant spiritual fear, it could not sit easily inside the usual explanations. There is a point where misfortune stops feeling ordinary and begins to feel engineered. In the Perigo household, that point appears to have arrived as Rebecca's condition worsened and the promises of cure began to sound like rehearsed excuses. Rebecca Perigo's decline ended in 1808. The details of her final days survived chiefly through what became evidence: witness accounts, later published retellings, and the frame constructed by prosecutors. What is clear is that Rebecca became seriously ill, and that her death did not feel like a natural ending to those around her. In cases involving poisoning, a death can look like an illness until someone decides it cannot be explained as illness anymore. That decision is often the most difficult part, because accusing a neighbor of murder, especially a woman known for healing, requires a leap that people are reluctant to make. Communities are built on fragile trust. Even in a poor city, people rely on each other. The idea that someone would deliberately bring death into a household is frightening not only because of the victim, but because it threatens everyone's sense of social safety. It is easier to believe in curses than it is to believe in predators. Curses do not make neighbors into monsters. Predators do. Yet Rebecca's death forced a reckoning. For William Perigo, grief likely arrived tangled with something else: doubt. Doubt about the wise woman who had taken so much and delivered so little. Doubt about the cure that seemed to accompany worsening symptoms. Doubt about the rituals that demanded obedience but produced only suffering. When a person dies under such conditions, the survivor is left with a terrible question. Was it always going to happen? Or was it made to happen? For William, the suspicion did not remain private. The story suggests he began to challenge Bateman's authority openly, refusing to accept explanations that now sounded thin. He may have felt anger at the money lost, at the helplessness of watching Rebecca decline, and at the sense of being manipulated inside his own home. Bateman's most important advantage, her control over narrative, depends on continuing access. If a victim dies and the household begins to resist, the predator's hold weakens. The predator must either reassert control or retreat. Bateman, who had survived public exposure before, likely attempted to maintain her authority. She could claim the curse had been too strong. She could claim that disobedience had interfered. She could claim that an enemy had escalated spiritual harm. But death changes what people are willing to believe. Death is a rupture. It breaks the rhythm of ritual and payment and creates a new reality in which the victim is gone, and the offender's promises are exposed as empty. Rebecca Perigo's death therefore became the breaking point. It was no longer merely a case of a family caught in superstition. It became a case with a dead woman, money extracted, and the growing realization that the wise woman's presence had not brought protection but harm. That realization does not always lead to action. Many victims of fraud remain silent, particularly when shame is involved. But this case did not remain quiet, because the death had created a line that could not be ignored. A fraud can be swallowed. A death demands an answer. Chapter 14, The Search. A wise woman's power is often built on secrecy. The rituals happen behind doors. The money moves quietly. The charms are hidden beneath floorboards and buried in corners. The victim is told not to speak. The offender relies on the fact that outsiders do not intrude. A search destroys that. Once authorities turned their attention towards Mary Bateman, the case shifted from household tragedy to legal confrontation. In working-class communities, state intervention could be slow and uncertain, but a suspicious death could force action, especially if a survivor was willing to insist that something criminal had occurred. The search of Bateman's home and possessions became the point where belief began to lose its protection. Objects do not care about performance. Objects do not respond to charm. Objects exist in plain fact, and when those objects include poison or goods stolen from victims, the offender's narrative collapses quickly. The historical record indicates that poison was found in Bateman's possession. This detail mattered not only because it supported the theory of murder, but because it anchored the case in something tangible. Without physical evidence, Bateman's defense could rely more easily on ridicule, suggesting that the Perigos were foolish, that Rebecca died naturally, that the wise woman's rituals were merely harmless superstition. Poison cannot be dismissed as harmless superstition. A search also tends to reveal the broader pattern beyond a single household. A con artist rarely harms only once. When their home is examined, it can contain traces of many victims, possessions taken, letters, charms, tools of the trade, evidence of repeated extraction. For Mary Bateman, whose work relied on performing hidden knowledge, the discovery of her materials would have been particularly damaging. The tools of a wise woman, written charms, strange ingredients, ritual objects, can be framed as harmless theater in a community where folk belief is common. But when paired with poison and stolen goods, the theater becomes predatory. The search therefore served two purposes. It provided evidence for Rebecca's death, and it exposed Bateman's broader exploitation. This exposure likely changed how the community spoke of her. A woman who had been treated as a figure of fascination or ridicule became a figure of danger. The witch label may have deepened, but it also shifted. It became less about superstition and more about moral judgment. In the public mind, witch becomes shorthand for a woman who harms deliberately. The state does not prosecute witches. It prosecutes criminals. The search moved Bateman from folklore to the machinery of law. She could still attempt performance, still claim innocence, still frame herself as misunderstood. But the evidence collected would follow her into court, and in court performance has limits. A jury might be swayed by emotion, but it cannot ignore objects that sit in front of them. Once the search was complete, the case began to tighten into charges. Bateman's fate moved out of household control and into state control. Her identity shifted again, no longer wise woman, no longer spectacle maker, but accused. Chapter 15, The Charge. Once a person is charged, their story changes hands. Before charges, a con artist can manage the narrative. They can choose what to reveal, what to deny, and how to perform. They can frame their victims as foolish. They can frame their critics as malicious. They can retreat into ambiguity. They can move to a new street and begin again. After charges, the state defines the story. Mary Bateman was no longer merely a local figure known for hoaxes and charms. She became, officially, an accused murderer. The language surrounding her hardened. Fraud became exploitation. Spectacle became deception. The death of Rebecca Perigo became the central fact the state demanded she answer. The charge was not only a legal act. It was a social transformation. Communities often tolerate fraud in a strange way. They gossip about it, mock it, whisper about it, sometimes even pay into it for comfort. Fraud can be treated as a moral failing but not necessarily as a threat. Murder is different. Murder forces the community to acknowledge that it is not merely dealing with foolishness or superstition. It is dealing with lethal intent. Bateman's earlier persona now became evidence of guilt rather than mere oddity. Her wise woman identity would have been framed as a method for entering households. Her claims of cures would have been framed as a way to gain access. Her hoaxes would have been framed as proof that she was willing to deceive publicly. Her extraction of money would have been framed as motive. This is how the state builds a story. It gathers a person's life into a pattern and argues that the pattern led inevitably to the crime. The press played its own role. Newspapers were not neutral conveyors of information. They shaped public appetite, public fear, and public judgment. A woman charged with murder already attracted attention. A woman charged with murder who was also labeled a witch became irresistible. The label Yorkshire witch gained momentum because it offered the public a clean narrative, a woman with hidden power who used it for harm. It provided drama. It provided moral clarity. It also allowed the public to treat the case as extraordinary, almost mythical, which made it easier to consume as entertainment. Yet beneath the label, the facts were brutally ordinary. A woman took money from frightened people. A woman was linked to poison. A woman was accused of killing someone who had trusted her. Charges also sharpen the question of motive. In Bateman's case, motive could be argued as profit, money and goods extracted through fraud. But motive likely contained something else as well, the satisfaction of control, the power of being believed, the dominance of shaping another person's reality. The prosecution would have needed to present Bateman's actions as intentional and calculated. The defense would likely have attempted to muddy that intention, framing her as a harmless fraudster, perhaps foolish, perhaps theatrical, but not murderous. This is where the case became more than a moral story. It became a legal contest. Chapter 16, York Castle, The Trial, March 1809. A trial is not simply a search for truth. It is a performance of authority. It takes human harm and reshapes it into procedure, questions, witnesses, exhibits, rules. It demands that grief be spoken in an orderly way. It demands that private suffering become public narrative. And in cases like Mary Bateman's, where belief, superstition, and class vulnerability sit at the center, it also becomes a stage on which society reassures itself that it is rational, that it can separate sense from nonsense, and that it can punish the person who disrupted the boundary between them. Mary Bateman's trial took place at York, in March 1809. By then, she was no longer simply Mary. She was a figure already shaped by public appetite, the Yorkshire witch, the notorious hoaxer, the woman who had frightened and fascinated Leeds. Courtrooms are meant to neutralize this kind of reputation, yet reputation always leaks in. Jurors are human. Witnesses are human. Spectators are human. And the press, even when not physically present, had already arranged the public's expectation. In Bateman's case, expectation carried a gendered charge. A man accused of poisoning might be framed as cunning or cruel, but a woman accused of poisoning was often framed as unnatural, deceptive, and doubly transgressive. Poison itself carried gendered associations. It is a method that hides within domestic labor. It turns cooking, feeding, and nursing into weapons. It suggests betrayal inside care. The prosecution's task was to turn Mary Bateman's relationship with the Perigos into a coherent narrative of predation. It was not enough to say that Rebecca Perigo died. People died of illness all the time. It was not enough to say that Mary Bateman sold charms. Many people sold charms. The prosecution had to show intent, that Bateman's actions were deliberate, that her fraud was not harmless theater, and that her involvement in Rebecca's life ended not in misfortune but in murder. This required witnesses. The Perigo household became the center of testimony. William Perigo's account mattered not only because he was the survivor, but because he represented the point where belief broke into suspicion. His words would have carried grief and anger, but in court grief and anger can be weaponized against a witness. The defense can suggest that anger makes a man unreasonable, that grief distorts memory, that suspicion grows from shame. This is one of the cruelest dynamics in cases like this. The victim's family must prove they were not simply foolish. They must prove they were harmed. Witnesses likely described the money taken, the rituals performed, and the treatments given. They described a woman who had inserted herself into a household and demanded obedience. They described the fear that had been cultivated and the way Bateman's influence shaped decisions. In a courtroom, however, superstition becomes awkward evidence. Jurors may laugh. Lawyers may sneer. The public may treat believers as ridiculous. Bateman's success relied on people believing. Her trial required those people to admit they had believed. The courtroom therefore carried not only the question of murder, but the shame of having been deceived. That shame could be used by the defense. It could also be used by the prosecution. The very fact that Bateman could deceive so effectively could be framed as proof of her skill and her danger. The physical evidence mattered most. A murder case becomes stronger when it can move beyond the ambiguity of testimony into material proof. Poison, if found in Bateman's possession, became central. It offered something the jury could grasp without needing to sympathize with the victim's belief. It provided a bridge between fraud and death. It turned the case from a foolish superstition story into a woman with lethal substance. The prosecution also had incentive to portray Bateman's hoaxes, including the prophet hen, not as harmless comedy, but as evidence of a pattern, a woman willing to manufacture proof, a woman willing to manipulate the public, a woman willing to profit from deception. This framing tightened the story. Bateman was not simply someone who stumbled into wrongdoing. She was someone who practiced it. Bateman herself, meanwhile, would have been forced into a different kind of performance. In her private work, she held authority. In court, she faced authority. She could no longer direct the story. She could only respond. Courtrooms break confidence artists in a particular way. They remove the offender's ability to control the emotional climate. The offender can still speak, but the judge and lawyers decide when the offender speaks and what the offender is allowed to say. The offender's former clients become witnesses. The offender's words are filtered through legal structure. For a woman whose entire power depended on controlling narrative, this loss of control would have been profound. Even so, offenders often maintain denial. Bateman could admit fraud yet deny murder, because admitting fraud does not carry the same moral weight as admitting murder. Fraud can be framed as desperation. Fraud can be framed as foolishness. Fraud can be framed as non-lethal. Murder cannot. The jury's role was to decide whether the prosecution's story held. Whether Bateman's presence in the Perigo household was merely opportunistic fraud, or whether it was something more, lethal predation. Chapter 17. The Verdict. A verdict is a moment of closure for the court. It is not always closure for the case. When the jury delivered its decision, it did more than determine Mary Bateman's legal guilt. It settled officially the question the community had been circling, whether the Yorkshire witch was merely a fraud or a murderer. The verdict transformed her from a figure of fascination into a symbol of moral danger. Mary Bateman was found guilty. The speed with which verdicts are later retold can become part of mythology. Stories of a jury quickly deciding, of evidence so obvious there could be no doubt, of guilt written plainly on the accused. The reality is often more layered. Jurors bring their own biases, their own discomfort with superstition, their own beliefs about female offenders, and their own willingness to accept testimony from working-class witnesses. Yet the outcome is clear. The court concluded she was responsible for Rebecca Perigo's death. This verdict mattered because it affirmed something the community may not have wanted to face, that a woman who offered help could be lethal. It also affirmed that the household's fears had not merely been misinterpreted as spiritual attack, they had been exploited by a human predator. Once guilt was established, Mary Bateman's remaining options narrowed quickly. In a legal world with limited mercy for convicted murderers, particularly those who had become notorious, the path ahead was grim. The verdict was not simply an answer. It was a sentence forming. Public reaction would have been intense. Trials in this era were not hidden behind modern privacy. They were public events, and public appetite for sensational cases was strong. Bateman's identity as witch made the case more than a murder trial. It made it a moral spectacle. The verdict therefore did not end public interest, it inflamed it. A convicted murderer becomes a public object. People speak of them as though they are no longer human. They become a symbol onto which fear and moral judgment can be projected. In Mary Bateman's case, the witch label amplified this effect. It allowed the public to imagine her not merely as a criminal, but as a kind of corruption made flesh. This has consequences. Once a person becomes a symbol, their punishment becomes theater. Bateman's own response after the verdict is preserved in fragments, in reports, letters, and later accounts. It appears she admitted to fraud but continued denying murder, even as the machinery of execution moved towards her. Denial in such moments can be interpreted in many ways, as genuine insistence, as stubborn performance, as refusal to give the public satisfaction, or as the last attempt to preserve some version of self. Whatever the internal truth, the public's interpretation of denial rarely matters. The public wants confession. The public wants certainty. The public wants the story to end in a way that feels complete. When an offender refuses to confess, myth grows. The verdict also sharpened the vulnerability of the Perigo family and others who had believed in Bateman. Once the trial concluded, their belief could be mocked more freely. The community could treat them as gullible. It could treat the case as a cautionary tale about superstition. But the deeper caution is not about superstition. It is about exploitation. A woman like Mary Bateman thrives where suffering is constant and where formal support is inadequate. Her victims were not simply people who believed strange things. They were people who needed help and were offered predation instead. The verdict marked the end of one phase. The next phase was short but culturally significant, the days between conviction and execution. These days would become part of Bateman's legend, and the way she behaved in them, her letters, her admissions, her denials, would be recorded, repeated, and reshaped. Chapter 18. 3 days. The time between conviction and execution is often described as waiting. In reality, it is a tightening. Every hour narrows. Every conversation carries the weight of inevitability. The condemned person's world becomes a small space, a cell, a handful of faces, the knowledge that a crowd is assembling somewhere in the imagination long before it assembles in reality. For Mary Bateman, this period was short. The brevity is shocking to modern sensibilities. There was no long appeals process, no years of delay. The state moved quickly, and the quickness served a purpose. It reinforced the power of the law and satisfied the public appetite for resolution. Public appetite, in this era, was literal. Executions were attended. They were watched. They were treated as events. Bateman's notoriety ensured that her death would not be quiet. During these days, Bateman wrote. Her final letter is often cited because it contains a crucial distinction. She admitted wrongdoing and fraud but maintained denial of murder. This admission matters because it confirms what the case already suggested, that her wise woman persona was a deliberate exploitation, but it also matters because it shows how offenders attempt to shape legacy even in the final hours. By admitting fraud, Bateman could position herself as flawed but not monstrous. By denying murder, she could resist the full moral condemnation attached to the charge. This is a familiar pattern in criminal history. Offenders sometimes admit lesser wrongdoing in order to preserve a final scrap of self-image, or to offer the public a partial confession while refusing the deepest admission. The state, however, did not require confession. It required compliance. In these final days, Bateman's body became the focus of institutional control. Prison routines, religious visits, preparation for execution, all of it functioned as a process of turning a living person into a condemned object. She was not simply being punished for murder. She was being transformed into a public lesson. This is where gender matters again. A condemned woman is often treated as a moral anomaly. Her death becomes a spectacle of correction. The public, already primed by the witch label, would have approached her execution as both entertainment and moral reassurance. The dangerous woman will be removed, the world will be restored. Yet executions do not restore victims. They restore a community's sense of control. As Bateman waited, the public prepared. Broadsheets were printed. Stories were repeated. People traveled. The condemned woman became the subject of conversation in streets and homes. Details were embellished. Fear mingled with excitement. The case moved further into myth as it approached its most theatrical moment. In the space of 3 days, Bateman's story was already being rewritten. The woman who had manipulated belief was now being consumed by it. Because even those who mocked the idea of witchcraft still wanted to see the witch die. The final hours before execution are rarely preserved in full, but the cultural pattern is clear. Condemned people are expected to perform penitence. They are expected to confess, to beg forgiveness, to deliver the moral conclusion the public desires. When they do not, the public often supplies the performance for them through published accounts. In Mary Bateman's case, the record holds the tension: admission of fraud, denial of murder, and the looming gallows. It is a compressed period that ends not in quiet reflection but in public death. Chapter 19, The Drop, March 20, 1809. Execution was designed to be seen. It was not merely the removal of a criminal. It was the performance of state authority in public space, a reminder to the living that the law could take a body as easily as it could take a life. People did not attend executions by accident. They attended because executions were events, and because watching punishment was treated as both entertainment and moral instruction. Mary Bateman was executed at York on March 20, 1809. By the time she reached the gallows, she was no longer simply a convicted murderer in the public imagination. She was the Yorkshire witch, a label that did not describe evidence, but appetite. The word had become the lens through which the crowd consumed her. It offered the thrill of superstition even for those who claimed to reject superstition. It offered the satisfaction of seeing a woman marked as unnatural, brought to an ending that felt corrective. The crowd mattered. Crowds are not passive. They bring energy, judgment, and hunger. They turn an execution into theater. They respond to small gestures, whispered rumors, and the posture of the condemned. They interpret the offender's face as confession or defiance. They decide whether the death feels satisfying or incomplete. Executions in this period drew enormous numbers, and Bateman's notoriety likely ensured a large gathering. People traveled for spectacle. Vendors sold food. Broadsheets were hawked and read aloud. The death of a notorious offender became a day out, a story to be carried home, an experience that could be retold for years. This is one of the most disturbing realities of public punishment. It reveals not only the offender's violence, but the public's willingness to consume violence when it is sanctioned. Mary Bateman's behaviour at the scaffold is preserved through accounts that must be treated carefully, because execution reporting often blended observation with sensationalism. Some reports emphasize composure, others emphasize fear, others push a moral message. The condemned woman repents, the condemned woman trembles, the condemned woman becomes the lesson. The truth is not always recoverable in full. What can be said with confidence is that the execution ended her life and began her afterlife as legend. The method of hanging used in this era was not the swift, engineered drop associated with later reforms. Executions could be prolonged. The condemned person could struggle. The crowd could witness not only death but the process of dying. This fact alone shapes how such events should be understood. Public executions were not clean. They were violent. They forced the community to watch a human body fail. This was the price of the public certainty. For the Perigo family and other victims of Bateman's fraud, the execution may have offered a grim form of validation. It confirmed that the state believed them. It confirmed that Bateman's actions were not dismissed as harmless superstition. It confirmed, in the most final way possible, that the offender had been judged. Yet execution does not restore what was taken. Rebecca Perigo remained dead. The money and goods extracted from victims remained extracted. The shame, fear, and confusion caused by Bateman's manipulation did not vanish because the manipulator was dead. What execution does is satisfy the system's need to close. The crowd watched, the law acted, and Mary Bateman's body was no longer her own. In the era's punishment culture, death was only part of the spectacle. The body was the next. Chapter 20, The Body. The 19th century did not treat the condemned body as sacred. It treated it as property. After execution, Mary Bateman's body was taken to Leeds General Infirmary. This transfer was not unusual. Bodies of executed criminals were often used for dissection and medical demonstration, both as punishment and as public lesson. The offender was not only denied life, they were denied privacy after death. In Bateman's case, the public interest did not fade at the gallows. It followed her corpse. Accounts describe large crowds gathering to view her body, with people paying for the opportunity. The act was framed as curiosity, but curiosity has sharp edges. A corpse displayed for crowds is not a neutral object. It is a continuation of punishment, and it is a continuation of spectacle. The public had wanted to see the witch die. They also wanted to see what the witch looked like when dead. This desire reveals something important about cultural fear. People do not merely want justice. They want proof. They want to see that the offender is truly gone. They want to stare at the body as if it can resolve the unease left behind by the crime. Bateman's corpse was dissected. In an era where anatomy was still often feared and misunderstood by the public, dissection carried its own horror. For some, it represented scientific progress. For others, it represented desecration. For the state, it represented additional punishment. The offender's body was useful to medicine and denied dignity. The intersection of punishment and medicine is complicated. Medical institutions sought bodies for learning, yet the use of criminal corpses also reinforced the idea that certain lives, and certain deaths, were resources for the state. The condemned were doubly consumed, first as a spectacle at the gallows, then as a spectacle on the dissection table. In Bateman's case, this consumption was intensified by the myth of witchcraft. Some people likely attended not out of medical interest, but out of superstition. They wanted to see the body for signs, for proof that she was ordinary, for proof that she was not. This is the paradox. Even as society punished superstition through law, it continued feeding superstition through spectacle. The body also became a source of relics in popular retelling. Stories emerged that strips of Bateman's skin were tanned into leather and sold, claimed as charms or souvenirs. The existence of such relic stories is significant whether every detail can be proven or not, because it demonstrates how quickly the public turned the condemned woman into an object that could be possessed. This is the final stage of dehumanization. The offender becomes a product. The body becomes material. The crowd does not only witness death, it takes pieces of it. In cases involving female offenders, this process often carries an added layer of gendered punishment. The condemned woman is treated as a moral violation, and her body becomes a site where society enacts both fear and control. She is punished not only for the crime, but for the disruption of what a woman is supposed to be. This is why the afterlife of Mary Bateman's body matters in a Truth First manuscript. It shows that the case did not end with her death. It continued as a cultural event. Her punishment became an industry of storytelling and souvenir. The public, which had been fooled by her hoaxes and drawn to her spectacle, remained hungry even after she was gone. Chapter 21: Skin, Relics, and the Birth of Legend. A case becomes legend when the public cannot stop retelling it. Mary Bateman's story did not remain a simple account of fraud and murder. It expanded into folklore almost immediately, fueled by sensational print, public spectacle, and the cultural usefulness of the witch label. The faster a story is repeated, the more it mutates. Details are sharpened. Motives become simpler. Scenes become more dramatic. The offender becomes less human and more symbolic. The most notorious legend attached to Bateman concerns her skin. Stories circulated that after her execution and dissection, strips of her skin were tanned into leather and sold, sometimes described as binding for books, sometimes described as charms or curiosities. This kind of relic story is not unique to Bateman. It appears in other historical cases where the public's appetite for punishment extended into possession. Whether every element of the story can be proven is less important than what the story itself reveals. It reveals that the public wanted more than death. It wanted ownership. It wanted a souvenir of evil. In a society that mocked superstition, the relic story is also deeply ironic. To purchase a piece of Bateman as a charm is itself an act of superstition. It suggests that even as people called her a witch in order to condemn belief, they also indulged belief by turning her into an object with imagined power. This is how legend works. It carries contradictions comfortably. The broadsheets and printed accounts of Bateman's life contributed heavily to this legend-making. These publications were often produced quickly, designed to sell, and shaped by moral messaging rather than strict accuracy. They exaggerated. They simplified. They sometimes included errors. They often framed Bateman as an almost theatrical villain, cunning, seductive, diabolical. Such accounts helped fix the witch label in public memory. They also helped fix the idea that Bateman's crimes were extraordinary, rather than the result of ordinary predation in a vulnerable community. A legend is easier to sell than a social history. The danger of legend is that it can erase victims. Rebecca Perigo becomes less a person and more a plot point. The Perigo household becomes less a struggling family and more a cautionary tale about foolishness. The exploitation that allowed Bateman's fraud to work becomes background noise. Legend centers the offender. Truth must center the harm. A truth-first approach therefore treats these relic stories and sensational accounts carefully. They belong in the narrative because they shaped public perception and because they show how society consumed Bateman. But they cannot be treated as evidence of the supernatural. They cannot be treated as proof of powers. They are proof of appetite, the appetite to turn fear into entertainment, and entertainment into commodity. Mary Bateman was not made into legend because of magic. She was made into legend because the public needed her to be. A con artist is unsettling because she reveals that ordinary people can be manipulated. A witch is more comfortable because she shifts the cause of deception from human vulnerability to supernatural threat. By calling Bateman a witch, society could condemn her while also avoiding the deeper question: why was she able to gain such power? The answer is not mystical. It is structural. It lies in poverty, illness, limited education, limited access to healthcare, and the human hunger for certainty. Mary Bateman stepped into those conditions and used them. The legend grew because those conditions remained. A legend is not only about the past. It is a symptom of the present. Chapter 22: What can be proven/what cannot. Mary Bateman's case sits at the edge of two worlds. One is the world of record, trial dates, witness testimony, documented hoaxes, the death of Rebecca Perigo, the conviction, the execution. The other is the world of legend, witchcraft, relics, moral exaggeration, sensational print, and the cultural craving for a story that feels larger than ordinary crime. A truth-first manuscript must hold both worlds without confusing them. Because Mary Bateman's power did not come from magic. It came from the human mind, and from the social conditions that made certain minds easier to trap. What can be proven begins with the broad shape of her life. Mary Bateman was born Mary Harker around 1768 in Yorkshire and later lived and operated in Leeds. She became known for fraud and deception, selling charms and cures as a wise woman. She gained public notoriety through the prophet hen hoax, which drew crowds and money before being exposed. This is not folklore. It is part of the historical record and a key demonstration of her method. She could manufacture proof and persuade people to witness it as truth. Her most serious crime involved Rebecca Perigo, who died in 1808 after becoming ill in circumstances the prosecution linked to poisoning. Bateman was tried at York in March 1809, convicted of murder, and executed on March 20, 1809. After her execution, her body was transferred to Leeds General Infirmary, where it was dissected, and her corpse became a public object. These facts are supported by the historical record. They are the spine of the case. They also establish the core conclusion: Mary Bateman was a fraudster whose deception escalated into murder. Yet even within proven facts, there are limits. The record does not preserve every detail of her childhood and early life. It does not provide a complete, uninterrupted timeline of her movements and minor offenses. Working-class women often vanish from documentation unless they collide with institutions, and Bateman's life is not preserved evenly. What survives tends to be what was sensational, what was criminal, and what was used as evidence. This unevenness creates gaps. Gaps invite invention. In many retellings, those gaps are filled with dramatic certainty, that Bateman was always wicked, always strange, always marked for violence. This is storytelling, not record. In truth, she appears to have been formed by ordinary conditions and an extraordinary willingness to exploit them. The record also does not preserve Rebecca Perigo as fully as it should. Rebecca is present in the case chiefly as a victim, not as a whole person. Her daily life, her personality, her hopes, and her interior world are largely absent because the legal system did not record victims for their humanity. It recorded them for their utility to prosecution. This is a limitation that cannot be repaired fully, but it can be acknowledged and resisted. The record has another limitation: the precise mechanics of coercion inside the Perigo household. The broad pattern can be reconstructed: fear, dependence, extraction, poisoning, but the details of daily conversations, emotional pressure, and domestic interactions survive only through fragments. A con artist's influence often occurs in small moments: a sentence spoken in a low voice, a look that produces obedience, a threat disguised as advice. These moments are rarely recorded. They are felt, not documented. What cannot be proven also includes much of what later print culture claimed. Broadsheets and sensational pamphlets were created to sell. They often exaggerated. They moralized. They dramatized. They treated Bateman as a theatrical villain. They sometimes made claims about her age, her motives, or her final words that do not align cleanly with more reliable sources. In this manuscript, these publications are treated as evidence of public appetite rather than evidence of factual detail. They reveal how society wanted to remember her. They do not necessarily reveal who she was. The relic stories are another boundary. Accounts that Bateman's skin was tanned into leather and used for bindings or sold as charms circulate widely. Some elements may have basis in documented practices of the time, but the details are difficult to prove with certainty. Such stories thrive because they are shocking, and because they feel like a fitting punishment for someone labeled a witch. Whether every element is true matters less than the cultural meaning. The public wanted her body not only destroyed, but possessed. The story persists because it feeds the same hunger that fueled the crowd at the gallows. This hunger is not supernatural. It is human. A truth-first account therefore reaches a final, clear understanding. Mary Bateman's story is not a witch story. It is a predation story. It is about a woman who understood that fear can be turned into obedience, and obedience can be turned into profit. It is about how illness and poverty produce vulnerability, and how vulnerability can be exploited by someone offering certainty. It is about how superstition is mocked by the educated, yet relied upon by those who cannot access other forms of help. It is about how communities consume offenders as spectacle, and how the public uses myth to avoid confronting the discomforting reality that ordinary people can be manipulated. The witch label allowed society to treat Bateman as extraordinary. The truth is that she was frightening precisely because she was not. She was a human being who used theater, persuasion, and poison. This is what can be proven. And this is what cannot be softened into folklore. The story ends in execution, but the real warning remains. Whenever suffering becomes common, and whenever certainty becomes a commodity, there will be people willing to sell it, and willing to harm those who pay. Conclusion: the witch was the word. The word which is where Mary Bateman's story began in public memory, and it is where it must end, not as agreement, but as exposure. Society called her a witch because it was useful. It was useful for turning fraud into something mystical rather than something calculated. It was useful for explaining why ordinary people believed her. It was useful for framing her as an anomaly rather than admitting she was the product of ordinary conditions and extraordinary opportunism. It was useful for turning a murder case into a moral fable. A witch is easier to condemn than a neighbor. A witch is easier to fear than a con artist. A witch is easier to kill than a woman whose crimes reveal uncomfortable truths about poverty, belief, and vulnerability. Mary Bateman did not need supernatural power. She built power through persuasion. She offered explanations when people were desperate for them. She offered control when people felt helpless. She offered rituals when people needed action. She offered certainty when the world offered none. The tragedy is that her victims needed help, and help was scarce. Rebecca Perigo's story is not the story of foolishness. It is the story of fear exploited. It is the story of how dependence forms quietly, how shame keeps victims silent, and how predators thrive in the spaces where formal systems fail to protect. Bateman's crimes were enabled by social conditions that remain familiar: limited access to care, the burden of poverty, the vulnerability of women managing illness in households with little support. Her punishment, too, reveals the world around her. The public did not simply want her dead. It wanted to witness her death. It wanted to consume her body. It wanted relics. It wanted stories. It wanted broadsheets that turned her into a spectacle. It wanted the satisfaction of certainty. In this way, Mary Bateman became a product. Her death did not end her story. It intensified it. What remains, when myth is stripped away, is not a witch tale but a warning about human vulnerability. People will believe extraordinary things when ordinary life is unbearable. Predators will step into that belief and call it salvation. They will use the language of care to gain access, and the rituals of faith to gain obedience. They will steal not only money but autonomy. And if they choose to escalate, they can hide harm inside the most domestic spaces: kitchens, cups, spoonfuls of comfort. Mary Bateman's case persists because it is unsettling in a way folklore cannot soothe. It suggests that the most dangerous people do not always arrive with obvious cruelty. Sometimes they arrive offering relief. The label which made her story feel safely distant. The truth makes it uncomfortably close. The witch was the word. The predator was the reality. And the victims deserved more than a moral fable built on their suffering. Bibliography. Primary/archival and museum sources. York Museums Trust. Prisoner Stories, Mary Bateman. York Museums Trust, accessed January 9, 2026. Thackeray Museum of Medicine. B170115, Mary Bateman, The Yorkshire Witch, and William Hay. Collections online, accessed January 9, 2026. Authoritative reference works. Davies, Owen. Bateman née Harker, Mary, 1768–1809, Thief and Poisoner. Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Oxford University Press, originally published 2004, updated September 1, 2025. Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Oxford, Oxford University Press, 2004. Scholarly/academic context. Ward, Richard. The Criminal Corpse, Anatomists, and the Criminal Law, Parliamentary Attempts to Extend the Dissection of Offenders in Late 18th Century England. Journal of British Studies 54, No. 1, 2015 63–87. Hurren, Elizabeth T. The Dangerous Dead, Dissecting the Criminal Corpse. Davies, Owen, and Francesca Mattioni. Executing Magic in the Modern Era, Criminal Bodies and the Gallows in Popular Medicine. Cham, Springer International Publishing, 2017. Books. Strevens, Summer. The Yorkshire Witch, The Life and Trial of Mary Bateman. Barnsley, Pen and Sword, 2015. Knipe, William. The Criminal Chronology of York Castle, with a register of criminals capitally convicted and executed at the county assizes. York, C. L. Budekin, 1867. Educational History Sources. My Learning, Thackeray Museum Partner Platform. The Yorkshire Witch, A Story of Murder and Witchcraft. Accessed January 9, 2026. General background/public-facing summaries. Wikipedia contributors. Mary Bateman. Wikipedia. Accessed January 9,